Society has conditioned you to believe that empathy is an absolute virtue, a universal sign of a pure heart. This is a fatal misconception. There exists a psychological predator moving seamlessly among us, a variation of the human mind known as the Dark Empath. They understand your pain perfectly, but they do not want to heal it. Instead, they use your suffering as a surgical blueprint, mapping the exact coordinates needed to dismantle your psyche from the inside out. Right now, you are trapped in a terrifying, cyclical loop. You keep trusting someone who constantly weaponizes your deepest insecurities, perfectly disguised as acts of profound care and concern. The trap is invisible, and the cost of remaining blind to it is absolute. If you do not decode this psychological mechanism right now, tomorrow morning you will wake up and willingly hand over the keys to your own mind to the exact same parasite. The bleeding must stop today. We are about to perform a clinical extraction of this psychological anomaly using the analytical framework of Carl Jung. I will show you the exact anatomy of this predator and provide you with the ultimate weapon for your survival. You will learn how to map the manipulator's own unintegrated shadow, turning their darkness against them. By the end of this, you will know exactly how to trigger the total structural collapse of their artificial, benevolent persona. The air in the dimly lit coffee shop hums with quiet conversation, but your reality narrows to the person across the table. You are confessing your deepest fear, finally feeling heard. They nod with flawless rhythm, mirror your body language, and speak the exact words your soul craves. But if you strip away the warmth and look closely, their eyes are utterly dead. They are not actually feeling your pain. They are systematically cataloging it. To understand the predator sitting across from you, we must divide empathy into its clinical forms. Affective empathy is the biological ability to physically feel another's pain. Cognitive empathy is merely the intellectual ability to understand how another is feeling. The Dark Empath possesses dangerously high levels of cognitive empathy, combined with absolutely zero affective empathy. They can read your emotional state perfectly, without absorbing a single drop of your suffering. In the framework of Jungian psychology, what you are interacting with is not a human soul, but an impenetrable persona, a highly sophisticated social mask. The Dark Empath specifically crafts the persona of the healer or the protector. They know that if they approach you as an aggressor, your walls will immediately go up. So they arrive disguised as your sanctuary. This mask is designed specifically to bypass your natural defense mechanisms and gain unrestricted access to your inner world. What feels like an intense, destined connection is actually a calculated psychological reconnaissance mission. The predator studies you and begins to actively mirror your anima or animus, Jung's terms for the unconscious, idealized image of your perfect counterpart. By reflecting this deep, archetypal image back at you, they create an artificial, highly addictive sense of absolute safety. You feel as though you have finally come home, but you have actually walked into a cage. The Dark Empath does not want to connect with you. They want to consume you. In this chilling dynamic, your vulnerability is no longer a bridge between two human beings. It is merely raw psychological data, actively being uploaded into their arsenal for future deployment. This brings us to a terrifying, paradoxical diagnosis of your reality. Why is the person who understands you the most intimately actually the exact same person equipped to destroy you the fastest? To answer that terrifying paradox, we must leave the abstract theory of the mind and enter the clinical reality of a modern corporate retreat. The air conditioning hums quietly in the background as Chloe, exhausted and vulnerable, drops her professional guard. She's venting to Julian about her crippling imposter syndrome, exposing the raw, unpolished edges of her self-doubt. She believes she is confiding in a trusted mentor.
Julian sits across from her, his posture relaxed and open. He listens with an intensity that feels incredibly validating, nodding at the exact right moments. He offers no judgment, only a perfectly calibrated reflection of her own anxiety. But this is not an act of camaraderie. It is the intelligence-gathering phase of a highly organized psychological operation. Every confession she makes is quietly and systematically catalogued. The trap has been set flawlessly, completely bypassing her normally high emotional intelligence. This brings us to a surgical examination of a fatal human flaw. How does your own desperate, entirely natural need to be understood become the exact blueprint for your psychological assassination? The answer lies in the specific mechanism the predator uses to process your vulnerabilities and turn them into ammunition. What Julian is executing is a predatory technique we can call shadow mapping. While you are speaking, the Dark Empath is actively scanning your psyche for repressed material. They are looking straight into your Jungian shadow, the collection of shame, fears, and profound inadequacies that your conscious ego desperately tries to hide from the world. They are finding the structural cracks in your psychological foundation. A standard narcissist operates with blunt force, blindly demanding attention and throwing tantrums when denied. The Dark Empath operates with the chilling precision of a surgeon. They do not react blindly. They carefully calculate the precise psychological weight of your insecurities. They measure exactly how much leverage each fear provides, storing these emotional pressure points in a dark arsenal for future deployment. Fast forward several weeks to the high-stakes environment of a critical board meeting. The promotion Chloe has bled for is on the table. Julian leans forward, his voice dripping with gentle concern, and casually mentions her recent struggles with feeling overwhelmed and her lack of senior experience. He uses the exact phrases she confided to him in private, detonating them publicly under the flawless disguise of care. This is a twisted, highly sophisticated application of projective identification. Instead of projecting his own shame onto her, the crude tactic of a common manipulator, Julian expertly activates the latent shame that already exists within her unconscious. He reaches directly into her shadow and turns the volume up to a deafening roar, forcing her to physically experience her own worst fears in front of an audience. By framing this brutal sabotage as empathy, the predator induces a state of severe cognitive dissonance in the victim. Chloe sits frozen at the conference table, her stomach plummeting. Her nervous system is screaming that she has just been violently attacked, but the social packaging, the soft tone, the concerned gaze, tells her it was an act of love. This paralyzing contradiction is exactly how the predator maintains absolute control. The paralyzing contradiction you felt in that boardroom inevitably demands resolution. We move from the public betrayal to the private aftermath, placing this psychological strike directly under the microscope. We are now standing in the stark, minimalist kitchen of Julian's urban loft. Chloe has finally realized the extent of the manipulation. She confronts him, armed with righteous anger and undeniable facts. But instead of defending himself, Julian does something far more dangerous. He does not raise his voice. He does not deny the event. Instead, he pours a glass of water, looks at her with an expression of profound pity, and gently begins to psychoanalyze her reaction.
He flawlessly weaves her childhood trauma into the current conflict, shifting the focus from his betrayal to her emotional instability. This brings us to a sickening paradox. Why do you inevitably end up apologizing to the person who just methodically drove a knife into your back?
To understand this reversal, we must surgically examine the mechanism of psychic inflation. By refusing to engage in the conflict on an equal emotional level, the Dark Empath assumes the archetype of the omniscient, rational judge. Julian artificially elevates his ego above the chaos of the confrontation. He is no longer a flawed human being who committed a betrayal. He has positioned himself as an untouchable observer, diagnosing a hysterical patient with absolute clinical detachment. The physical atmosphere in the loft shifts from a heated argument to a cold, sterile interrogation room. Chloe's heart rate spikes. Her legitimate anger hits this wall of weaponized calm and begins to fracture. When you are met with absolute, terrifying stillness in the face of your pain, your brain struggles to process the asymmetry. The predator uses your escalating emotional state as undeniable proof that their clinical assessment of your instability is completely and objectively accurate. This introduces a volatile Jungian principle known as enantiodromia, the inevitable tendency of an extreme force to turn into its exact unconscious opposite. The Dark Empath relies on this law of physics within the psyche. By remaining perfectly, unnaturally calm, Julian pushes Chloe's anxiety to its absolute breaking point. At that critical threshold, her righteous anger suddenly exhausts itself and violently flips into its opposite, a crippling, paralyzing wave of deep self-doubt. Suddenly, the victim begins to wonder if they really are the abusive one for daring to question the relationship. If you have ever felt this exact, dizzying inversion of reality, if you have ever found yourself apologizing for being betrayed, hit the like button and share your story in the comments. You are not crazy, and you are not alone. To ensure you never fall into this cognitive trap again, subscribe to the channel as we continue to map out this terrifying, predatory architecture. What you have just witnessed is the highest, most lethal tier of advanced gaslighting. This is not the clumsy, amateur tactic of simply lying about objective facts or denying that an event occurred. It is a highly systemic, surgical destruction of your ego reality testing. Your ego is the psychological faculty responsible for perceiving the external world accurately. The Dark Empath methodically dismantles this internal compass, feeding it corrupted data until it shatters entirely. Once your reality testing apparatus is destroyed, a terrifying dependency is born. You can no longer trust your own memories, your own gut instincts, or your own emotional responses. You become completely reliant on the manipulator to interpret the contents of your own mind. Julian has effectively outsourced Chloe's perception of reality to himself. He has convinced her that her defense mechanisms are actually symptoms of an illness that only he has the saintly wisdom to patiently endure. You are now locked in a psychological prison where the warden is also your therapist. The Dark Empath has successfully neutralized the threat of your independence by convincing you that your mind is a danger to yourself. But this flawless execution of cognitive empathy requires a staggering amount of psychic energy to maintain. The mask of the omniscient judge is heavy. And what happens when the audience leaves, the loft is empty, and the predator is finally forced to look into the mirror? To answer that, we must shift the surgical light away from the wounds of the victim and point it directly at the underlying pathology of the predator. The argument is over. and Julian is finally alone in his pristine, minimalist loft. The performative mask is no longer required. The apartment is dead silent, illuminated only by the cold, sterile glow of his smartphone screen. But as the silence stretches, the victory sours, replaced by a sudden, terrifying flash of absolute emptiness. This ringing emptiness is a psychic void so absolute that he cannot sit with it for even a moment. His fingers move frantically across the glass screen, desperately drafting a text message to a former victim just to elicit a response. The predator is suddenly starving. This exposes a profound structural contradiction in everything we know about power. What is the one psychological terror that the master manipulator spends their entire life frantically running from? The clinical diagnosis for this chilling isolation is severe ego self-alienation. From the outside, the Dark Empath appears as a towering, invincible intellect. But this is nothing more than a highly fortified persona. Beneath that flawless social armor, their core Jungian self is completely hollow. It is a ghost town, an authentic identity that was violently abandoned during early psychological development in order to survive an environment that demanded absolute perfection. Because there is no internal structure to generate genuine self-worth, their entire psychic energy, what Jung termed libido, must be relentlessly directed outward. They are forced to live as psychological parasites. They cannot look inward because their internal landscape is dominated by a completely unintegrated, terrifying shadow. Their own repressed shame and inadequacy form a monstrous abyss that they spend every waking second trying to avoid looking directly into. This reveals the ultimate truth about the Dark Empath's arsenal. They do not manipulate because they possess extraordinary transcendent strength. They manipulate because movement is survival. If they stop pulling the strings of others, if they stop consuming the emotional reactions of their victims, the external noise fades. Without that noise, gravity takes over, and they are forced to fall straight down into their own bottomless existential abyss. Their obsessive, meticulous need for control is not a display of dominance. It is, fundamentally, a desperate, pathological defense mechanism against their own psychological disintegration. Every mind they read, every reality they fracture, and every tear they extract is merely a temporary patch on a sinking ship. Julian texts his former victim not because he misses her, but because her emotional response confirms that he actually exists in the physical world. The cognitive empathy they wield so flawlessly is actually a curse. They understand human connection on a cellular level, yet they are biologically blocked from ever experiencing its warmth. They are condemned to wander through a world of vibrant emotion while wearing a heavy, leaden diving suit. The Dark Empath is the ultimate psychological tragedy. A brilliant machine capable of decoding the human soul, yet entirely locked out from possessing one of its own. But this structural flaw is exactly what makes them beatable. A predator that relies entirely on an external food source will starve the moment the supply is cut. Once you understand that their intimidating intellect is actually a frantic scramble for survival, they cease to be a terrifying god and become a fragile, predictable machine. The question now is how to wield this knowledge. How do you surgically blind a mind reader when you are trapped in their gaze? To blind this mind reader, we must apply a psychological scalpel to your own vulnerabilities, completely removing the leverage they rely on. We return to the glass walls of the corporate boardroom. It is the next major meeting, and Julian is about to attempt the exact same surgical strike.
He leans forward, voice dripping with that familiar, fabricated concern, noting Chloe's recent stress and casually suggesting he take over her project to lighten her heavy load. This is the critical juncture. How do you defeat a predator whose cognitive empathy allows them to perfectly read your thoughts, especially when you can no longer hide your anxiety? The standard response would be to flinch, to get defensive, or to emotionally scramble to prove your competence. But Chloe does not move. Her pulse remains steady. She looks directly at Julian and calmly agrees with the factual premise of his statement, while entirely stripping his words of their emotional poison.
"Yes, the project is exceptionally demanding," she replies, offering absolutely no apology. "To execute this maneuver, you must engage in a process Carl Jung called shadow integration. This requires you to consciously own your insecurities, your imposter syndrome, and your deepest flaws. Instead of desperately burying these perceived weaknesses in the dark, you deliberately bring them into the harsh light of your conscious ego, making them an accepted piece of your identity."
A dark empath is essentially a psychological hacker. They can only weaponize the specific parts of yourself that you actively refuse to accept. Their entire strategy relies on the shame you attach to your imperfections. When you consciously own your darkness and stop running from your own incompetence or fear, their highly tuned cognitive empathy scans your psyche and discovers a barren wasteland. They reach for the levers of your shame, but there is absolutely nothing left to pull. What Chloe deployed in that boardroom is a tactical mechanism known as radical acceptance. By casually agreeing with the surface-level critique without absorbing a single drop of the intended shame, she completely neutralizes the psychic charge the manipulator desperately relies upon. She admits the stress exists, turning it into a boring, objective fact rather than a fatal character flaw. The weaponized empathy hits the armor of her self-awareness and shatters on impact. In this clinical transaction, the predator is instantly deprived of the expected emotional reaction. There is no panic, no tearful defense, and no frantic submission. This reaction is their narcissistic supply, the external psychological food source we previously established they need to survive. By delivering a flat, unemotional agreement, you effectively cut the oxygen line to their artificial reality. The dynamic violently shifts from manipulation to absolute starvation. Without this vital supply, the dark empath experiences an immediate, catastrophic structural failure. Their inflated persona was designed specifically to reflect your anxiety back at you, maintaining the illusion of their superiority. But when you present a perfectly calm, integrated front, they suddenly have nothing left to mirror. The omniscient judge costume becomes absurdly heavy, and the fragile machinery operating beneath their social mask begins to rapidly break apart. Look at the shifting power dynamic in that glass room. Julian stutters, the fabricated concern melting into genuine, panicked confusion as his colleagues watch. He is exposed, completely disarmed by a victim who simply refused to be ashamed of being human. This is the surgical precision of psychological alchemy. You do not defeat the mind reader by building thicker walls. You defeat them by making your mind a place where their parasitic tactics can no longer take root. The tactical victory we just witnessed in that glass boardroom is only the beginning. Step out into the clear, cold morning air. The hypnotic spell that bound you to this predator is permanently broken. You are looking directly at the manipulator, but they no longer look like a towering god, a trusted mentor, or an invincible demon. You see them exactly as they are. A deeply flawed, desperately hollow mechanism running on a highly predictable, parasitic script. The psychological surgery is finally over.
Chloe's triumph was just an example, a clinical demonstration of the mechanics at play.
But your actual battle is happening right now, in your own life, against your own predators. You have been taught that to survive, you must become flawless, hiding your insecurities behind thick walls. But true invulnerability is never the absence of weakness. True invulnerability is the total, conscious ownership of your darkness. It is looking into the abyss of your own flaws and refusing to blink.
The highest aim of Jungian psychology is individuation, the arduous process of becoming a completely whole, indivisible entity. A fully integrated self is psychologically bulletproof. It cannot be gaslit because it no longer fears its own reflection. You do not actually need to fight the Dark Empath or engage in a grueling war of attrition. You merely need to remove the unconscious hooks they have buried deep in your psyche. Once those hooks of shame are gone, the parasite naturally falls away. Your capacity to feel deeply for others is a profound psychological gift, not a fatal liability. But moving forward, that empathy must be guarded by an inner citadel of ruthless self-awareness. You must become a sovereign entity who observes without absorbing. When the predator attempts to scan your vulnerabilities using their cognitive empathy, let them look. Let them read your mind. They will no longer find a terrified victim desperate for validation. They will only find cold, unyielding iron. This is the moment you reclaim the absolute sovereignty of your mind. If you are ready to forge this new armor and break the cycle of manipulation, I want you to go down to the comments right now and type this exact declaration. I own my shadow, and my mind is mine alone. Let this physical action serve as your permanent manifestation ritual, anchoring your conscious intent into reality. Subscribe to this channel to join a community of minds committed to this profound psychological alchemy. The monster no longer holds power over you because you have finally illuminated the dark corners where it used to hide. The Dark Empath can only hunt in the shadows of your own self-deception. By integrating your fears, you have dismantled their entire arsenal, leaving them starving in the light of your awareness. Walk forward with the quiet confidence of a mind fully owned. Stay strong, and until next time.